All right, well, thanks very much to everyone for coming out today. My name's Sid. I'm the organizer with the International Socialists here in Canada. We are doing this as part of our sort of International Socialist Study Series, which has been happening over the course of this summer and will continue into the fall, where we're going to take a little bit of time and dig into the politics of a few revolutionaries and some Marxist understanding of how the world is operating right now. And so today's discussion will be the revolutionary ideas of Karl Marx, and the speaker is Chantal Sundaram, who's a longtime anti-racist, a socialist activist, labor activist, has been involved with Quebec Solidaire, Community Solidarity Ottawa, and is a leading member of the International Socialists. Just before we start, I'm going to read an acknowledgement. As settlers, we acknowledge our occupation of lands that are the Indigenous territories of Turtle Island. Furthermore, we support all struggles for Indigenous sovereignty in whatever forms they may take by the hundreds of First Nations and Inuit communities that have resided here for many thousands of years, and by Métis communities that have developed in the last hundreds of years. As well as words, we need active support for struggles for Indigenous sovereignty. And so if you look down into the chat window, you're going to find a link to the ongoing 1492 land back lane struggle for Haudenosaunee land rights in the Haldimand Tract in Ontario. There's also links there for you to be able to make donations. We don't just do land acknowledgements, we need active solidarity in support of Indigenous sovereignty. And so, having said that, without further ado, we are going to introduce Chantal to be able to give us a discussion about the revolutionary ideas of Karl Marx. So Chantal, go ahead.
Thank you. And I'll just say that I am speaking from unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people in the place now known as Ottawa. I've taken on a colossal task to basically sum up the revolutionary ideas of Karl Marx. This discussion can go in a lot of different directions, but I think the description for this particular study group describes Marx as the most thorough critic of capitalism, but also talks about how Marx's method for understanding the system can provide a foundation for creating a new world. So that's really what I'm going to focus on. I'm not going to go into detail about Marx's analysis of the capitalist economy, because we actually have an upcoming study group specifically on that at the end of this month, which will be an excellent follow-up to this. But what I'm going to talk about today is Marx's theory of revolution, because Marx spent his life both analyzing the way capitalism functions and what it takes to move people to question it. One of his most famous quotes is that the philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it. And at the heart of this is not only how capitalism and all its injustices can change, but also about how change is an ongoing feature of all of human society and history. But that it's not ideas by themselves that make change. And so Marx's theory of revolution does start with a theory of history, often referred to as historical materialism. So I'm going to start by summarizing that a little bit. And for me, I'll say that when I first started reading Marx, that was one of the most exciting moments, was reading his account of historical change throughout human history and reading about that story. And there's some great things that maybe we can note in the chat, works that Marx has written, but also others have built on to tell that story. In our tenants, we have a book called People's History of the World, which it applies that theory of human history to the entirety of human history and really looks at how many struggles that have emerged show a pattern of resistance and revolution throughout history. But I think the starting point for Marx was that forms of society arise as they first further the development of human productive power to produce a higher standard of living, and fall as they come to impede the development of human productive power or create a crisis within the society which doesn't allow it to move forward. And within this process, political struggles over what it means to further develop or impede development arise, and clashes over interests and whose interest is historical change or making societal change. In other words, the clash of different classes in society produces a clash of ideas. So Marx's theory of history is a challenge both to the theories, other theories of history as being some kind of inevitable progress, or theories that just describe history as chaos due to human nature being chaotic. Marx's view of history has a pattern, but its starting point is not just the progress of thought and ideas, but the interaction of real individuals, their activity, and the material conditions of their life, both the conditions they already have to deal with to survive and those new conditions that are produced by their own activity in dealing with problems of better and better survival. Marx started by looking at this in terms of what makes us human, our drive as a species to come up with increasingly intelligent and creative ways to solve problems of survival, and then how our own solutions over time have created new barriers to supporting all humans equally. Marx started by looking at this reality in hunter-gatherer societies and traced it all the way through to the various class-based societies. And through this, as I was saying, it tells an amazing story about how actual societies have changed. And he also developed through this a method about how they can change. The key is about understanding the social relations of production. Humans have evolved to be natural laborers who think and work to transform the world around us, but in a fundamentally social way, which gives us unique advantages and unique challenges compared to other animals. Work is necessarily a social activity, since it depends upon the cooperation of a number of individuals in order to achieve a common goal. But the relationships between individuals are determined by the material constraints of producing in a certain way. And this has two aspects. The allocation of tasks to the producers will reflect the nature of the labor process in major operation at the time, as well as the skills of the individuals. But there is a second social aspect to production, one in which the means of production, the tools and the raw materials, not just the human mind and body, become a very decisive element. And so Marx writes, whatever the social form of production, laborers and means of production always remain factors in it. For production to go on, they must unite. The specific manner in which this union is accomplished distinguishes the different economic epochs of the structure of society from one another. So Marx argues that we cannot understand the nature of production and society, therefore the nature of society itself, without examining who controls the means of production. And this is for two reasons. First, once we've got past the most primitive forms of agriculture, no labor process can take place without means of production. And so, there's a lot we could say about how Marx described this taking place at the beginning, the consolidation of capitalist society, which involved cutting off the majority of the population from any way for any connection to means of production that they could use to support themselves. And he writes about the enclosure of the commons in England as like a prime example of that, cutting off people from being able to use common land for some kind of agricultural production of their own. And having this means of subsistence cut off from people meant that you had a huge pool of people who had nothing to sell or nothing to live by except their own ability to work. And that was the beginning of the creation of a working class under capitalist society. And then if you look later, even with the elimination of African slavery, which had built US capitalism and spurred capitalism globally, the Edict of 40 Acres and a Mule, which was part of a wartime order proclaimed in 1865 during the American Civil War to allot land to some of the freed families, freed from slavery, did nothing to alter either the fundamental relations of production or the way racism continued to be woven into the social relations of US capitalism, because it's about who owns the overall social means of production in a society that determines what kind of society it is and who has political control. But also the distribution of the means of production provides the key to the division of society into classes. There is no inherent necessity in the labor process that requires that the producers, those of us who do the actual work, should control the means of production, the tools and the raw materials. So classes arise when the direct producers have been separated from the means of production, which is the process that I just mentioned that happens with the enclosure of the commons. But there's also a constant struggle over this. And I think that's part of the story that I can't go into a lot of detail here, but it's because I'm trying to focus on the method and the theory behind it. But again, I think there's so many excellent, more specific works that have applied Marx's method to looking at concrete moments in history and the type of struggle that has existed around control of the means of production. Capitalism creates the conditions for ideas to change on a mass scale in a way that's different from previous historical societies, however. And I think that's where Marx's theory of history is leading. And so for the social relations of production to be fundamentally different, this is what's required, is that for ideas to change on a scale that they never quite were able to in previous times in human history. But I think what's equally important is that Marx's theory of history and of revolution argues strongly that this is not inevitable. That social change, historical change, doesn't always lead to something better. It can end in the mutual destruction of the contending classes and either result in a stagnation of the productive forces that continues to disenfranchise the majority of society, or lead to accelerated war, conflict, and in the context of ancient societies, sometimes the loss of amazing acquired knowledge, like in the case of, incredible scientific and philosophical developments in China, Greece, Rome, the Arabic world, that were temporarily lost because of the crises that developed in those societies. And if we look at the situation we find ourselves in today, I think we are staring that stark reality in the face, that there are so many things that point towards the need and possibility for change, but also so many things that threaten to potentially throw our society backwards in a massive way, in so many ways, not to mention, of course, the threat of climate disaster and extinction that we face. So that is a short form about Marx's theory of history. We can certainly talk more about it in the discussion, but then we have to say, okay, how can ideas change under capitalism? What does Marx's theory of history mean for that? And I think it's important to say that Marx actually started not looking at the capitalist economy first. That was incredibly important when he got to that piece. But when he started thinking about human interaction in society, he started by thinking about the question of alienation under capitalist society. The fact that we are alienated in 4 ways under capitalism. We're alienated from our own labor, our own ability to work, the thing that should give us most, satisfaction and feeling at home with ourselves. We're separated from that. And therefore, we're alienated, separated from our own nature as a species, and therefore from our very self, and therefore from other humans. And then the 4th way that we are alienated under capitalism is that we are separated from nature and natural processes. So understanding social relations of production that turn some humans into cogs in a machine without control over their own ability to work meaningfully was actually key to not only understanding how to change the capitalist economy, but how to change ideas. And this is connected to the whole history of how ideas and societies have changed that I just described. But it really does take on a critically different character under capitalism. And this is what Marx and his partner in revolutionary crime, Engels, Friedrich Engels, really emphasized. And so in 1879, Marx and Engels summed up their politics in these words: "For almost 40 years, we have stressed the class struggle as the immediate driving power of history, and in particular, the class struggle between bourgeoisie and proletariat is the great lever of the modern social revolution. When the International was formed, we expressly formulated the battle cry: the emancipation of the working class is conquered by the working classes themselves." And this was a really fundamental idea, because if you look at previous resistance movements in history, many of which are very inspiring, the question of the self-emancipation of an oppressed class is not something you see in its totally, in all its possibility until we get to capitalist society. But then the question poses itself: why do so many working class people often think the capitalist system, the capitalist economy, can't change to be more equitable or different? Many of those who say they don't think of themselves as socialists necessarily will answer that it's not because they don't identify with ideals of social justice or because they think we need the market, but because they don't see a way that we can get rid of private property easily or in the short term. So the answer is often not that things shouldn't be different, but how? How can they be? Not because capitalism seems effective, but because it seems insurmountable or even unchangeable. The dominant ideas are the ideas of the ruling class, not because they make more sense, but because the ruling class controls most things in society that shape ideas. But then we come back again to the whole question of what drives historical change, what has arrived at historical change in the past. Ideas themselves don't make history. People's place in society shapes their consciousness. But at the same time, human societies have changed enormously, and ideas have played a role in that process. And this is why Marx found it really important to study the whole process of change prior to capitalism, to understand what can bring working people into direct conflict with the dominant ideas of the ruling class and convince them that real change is possible. So two things about this flow from that theory of historical materialism, but are especially true in capitalist society. The first is that social reality in all class societies is contradictory, and people are not just passively molded. Daily experiences often contradict the official ideas of society. The second equally important thing is that struggle is a necessary and inevitable part of social existence. And struggle itself holds the possibility of changing consciousness in a deep way, even when it's not a totally self-aware process from the beginning. The other famous quote about this from Marx, which is actually, I think, one of my favorites, is that people make history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing. And in the process of making change, they change themselves and their ways of thinking. So getting back to the way capitalism seems unchangeable, the little amount of private property that most of us own is immaterial. It is fundamentally about the social means of production and who owns that, the way that big question defines the economy and politics. And one way to think about it is sort of like the shift that I think increasing numbers of people are making and have made in thinking about the climate. Realizing that the little amount that we can do as individuals to recycle and try to be good climate citizens is not what is going to shift what's happening to the planet. It requires a big rethink about who makes the big decisions about the economy, and it is those who own the means of production who are in a position to do that. So how do we change the social means of production to something different? Marx argued, and I agree, we need a social revolution based in workplaces to change things. But there is a watchdog over the means of production that exists outside the workplace. So even if that's really where a source of power lies, there's also another source of power outside the workplace, and it's a wolf in sheep's clothing. It is the so-called democratic state, whether it be parliamentary, republican, constitutional monarchy, or a more dictatorial type of state. It is a state that exists in various forms to protect capitalist means of production, and it's wedded to the protection of private property. Marx always thought the state had to be transformed somehow, but it wasn't until the class struggle took it into its own hands spontaneously that it became clear that the same process of change through struggle that he had been analyzing throughout history held the key problem of political power in capitalist society. And so it was witnessing what happened in Paris in 1870-71 when workers spontaneously took over Paris for an impressive period of time and formed what was known as the Commune, the Paris Commune. Marx learned from the experience to come up with what was kind of the missing piece in his theory of revolution. He wrote about it in an amazing political pamphlet called The Civil War in France, which he read to the General Council of the International Workers Association on May 30th, 2 days after the last resistance of the Paris Commune's fighters was overcome by terrible repression in 1871. Marx wrote that we can now see, or could now see in that struggle, that working people can't just take over Parliament or the rest of the state machinery that had grown up to protect private property and the whole political status quo. The Commune had put into question not only the role of the police that we are still challenging today, but even the larger state structure. Marx wrote, from the very outset, the Commune was compelled to recognize that the working class, once come to power, could not go on managing with the old state machine. That in order to not lose, sorry, I've got a mistake here. It's they must, on the one hand, do away with all the old repressive machinery previously used against itself, and on the other, safeguard itself against its own deputies and officials by declaring them all, without exception, subject to recall at any moment. Marx wrote about the Commune to celebrate the courage and ingenuity of the ordinary working people of Paris who are capable of taking their destiny into their own hands, but he also wrote about it to insist that it uncovered an important lesson for future struggles. The working class can't simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and just wield it for its own purposes. The Paris Commune was only the first in a series of new state structures that were created by working people in the heat of the revolution since that time. In Russia, twice, not just in 1917, but earlier in 1905, they were called Soviets. In Chile, in 1972 and 73, they were called cordones. In Iran in 1979, they were called shoras. And even twice in Canada, from the strike committees that were set up in Winnipeg in 1919, that came to operate city services and deliver food and necessities without managers. We saw the beginnings of that kind of workers' power there as well. And later in Quebec, in the 9 towns that were taken over temporarily by Quebec workers during an illegal wildcat strike in 1972, we saw that pattern again of workers having the capability not just to withdraw their labor, but to restart their labor under their own control. And this was a key thing for Marx to witness in the Commune, and held a lesson going forward about a true path towards human liberation. Because the central role of working class labor was at the heart of Marx's analysis of capitalism, but it was also at the heart of his theory of revolution and its capacity for human potential to be liberated. And he did see that in the Commune. He described it like this. Its true secret was this: it was essentially a working class government, the product of the struggle of the producing against the appropriating class, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economic emancipation of labor. Marx continues, except on this last condition, the economic emancipation of labor, the communal constitution would have been an impossibility and a delusion. The political rule of the producer cannot coexist with the perpetuation of their social slavery. The Commune was therefore to serve as a lever for uprooting the economic foundations upon which rests the existence of classes and therefore of class rule. With labor emancipated, every person becomes a working person, and productive labor ceases to be a class attribute. So I think I'm, yes, 20 minutes or so. Okay, I guess I have 5 minutes left. I'm going to go really quickly through Marx's theory of revolution today. And this is, again, another, could be a talk in itself. But we have to say something about the legacy of Stalinism, something that Marx could never have predicted. And also something about the legacy of social democracy, which is something that was developing during the course of Marx's lifetime and shortly thereafter. And while Marx may not have written so much about that, or certainly not about Stalinism, there's a wonderful pamphlet by the American Marxist socialist Hal Draper called The Two Souls of Socialism. And what he writes about is that these two forms of so-called socialism, Stalinism and social democracy, are both forms of socialism from above. And he writes, in one part of the spectrum, a number of social democratic parties have virtually eliminated any specific socialist demands from their programs, promising to maintain private enterprise wherever possible. In what sense are these parties still socialist? In another part of the world picture, there are the communist states. However, the socioeconomic system which has replaced market capitalism there would not be recognizable to Karl Marx. The state owns the means of production, but who owns the state? certainly not the mass of workers who are exploited, unfree, and alienated from all levers of social and political control. These two self-styled socialisms are very different, but they have more in common than they think. Social democracy has dreamed of socializing capitalism from above. Its principle has always been that increased state intervention in society and the economy is per se socialistic. It bears a fatal family resemblance to the Stalinist conception of imposing something called socialism from the top down and of equating statification with socialism. But the key to overcoming this confusion about what socialism is lies in the method Marx developed to understand how human thinking changes. The struggle to define what socialism means in the sense of not just what we are fighting against, but what we are fighting for, emerges through most movements for social change, but not in an automatic and clear way. It takes conscious reflection on exactly what kind of social change we need and how it is possible for things to move forward. So, as I said, Marx wasn't a philosopher or even an academic scholar. He was an activist and an organizer of international revolutionary groupings. In addition to being a revolutionary activist, he was a revolutionary journalist. He wrote factual news stories based on his approach to political struggle, which were never neutral. And he developed a theory of praxis, which is about the interaction between revolutionary theory and how you test it out in the real world and what you learn from those struggles and how that advances your understanding and your theory. So I'm going to move to a conclusion now, because as I tried to show, the theory of revolution that Marx came up with is about both a long history of a power struggle between different classes throughout human history, but it's also about the particular type of struggle that now is made possible by capitalism. Marx and some of the people who built on the method he came up with after him emphasized how material forces create the context for spontaneous rebellions against immediate injustice, but also potentially for a more revolutionary transformation, whether or not people are conscious of it at the time. And I'll just quote one other well-known Marxist revolutionary, Rosa Luxemburg, who wrote, "How does a people or a class become fit to rule in their own name? Only by fighting to do so, only by waging their struggle against oppression by those who tell them they are unfit to govern. Only by fighting for democratic power do they educate themselves and raise themselves up to the level of being able to wield that power. There has never been any other way for any class." And I think the same statement by the oppressed acting in their own name has been repeated and developed over and over by Marxists since, from Fred Hampton and Angela Davis of the Black Panthers, and indigenous Marxists like Howard Adams, and many others since, who are finding theoretical ways to express a theory of revolution that is based both on a solid material understanding of not only that things should be different, but really how they can be different. And the rest belongs to us to take that forward and apply them to the struggles that we're all involved in. I'll leave it there.